Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Biome podcast with me, Kate, and I have Emma and Robi with me, of course. This week we are going to be talking about the meaning of wild and pretty much talking about fences and national parks and what it truly means to be wild. What classifies an area or an animal as wild in our minds? So obviously nowadays a lot of terrestrial wildlife live in fenced off areas in kind of national parks or on private game reserves or something similar, but we still would consider them wild animals. So we're just going to kind of talk about that really. This episode is going to be quite theory based and pretty abstract, I think, in points in terms of the discussions rather than always being practical or about specific examples. So it's kind of more of a discussion around some of the historic techniques used in conservation and kind of how they fit into a modern world and how we think about the wild and wilderness. And as always, we'd love to hear what you guys think. So feel free to get in touch or leave us a comment because we think it's going to be quite an interesting and slightly different conversation this week. So Emma, do you want to kind of start by talking about like the rise of fences and kind of how we got to where we are now?
I love that. The rise of fences.
I love this. This is just, it's a very kind of abstract episode. It's brilliant. So I think when we're talking about the rise of fences, we're going to talk about what's called fortress conservation. So this is basically the establishment of protected areas for wildlife by excluding human activity. So Oxford Reference defines this as the creation of protected areas for terrestrial or marine wildlife by the coerced displacement or exclusion of the existing inhabitants. So it is something that has been heavily criticised, but it is kind of very present today, and I think particularly as human settlements continue to grow and human and wildlife habitats become even more interlinked than they already are, it's something that we need to consider. And so this idea of fortress conservation was spearheaded by Richard Leakey when he was the director of the Kenyan Wildlife Service. And his view is that parks are these self-contained ecosystems that kind of had to be fenced in and humans kept out. So I think it kind of flips it on its head quite a lot, the idea of keeping humans out rather than animals in. And there's some interesting case studies with this, aren't there, about fortress conservation?
Yeah, I think the one, again, this is quite an abstract, very kind of large-scale example, but elephants in Africa are quite a good species to look at fortress conservation through. But it's kind of interesting what you mentioned just then, and I guess at the time when they were setting up all these national parks, it probably felt like quite a good idea, I'd imagine, because if you think about it, fortress conservation is kind of the origin method of governance of a lot of the big famous national parks. And I guess when they were setting them up, conservation hadn't really been done before, and it is kind of the logical your first instinct if you've got like an endangered species. Oh, put a fence around it, then it's not endangered. But it's interesting. So I'm going to talk a bit about elephants now, and kind of maybe as we go through history, we can see how gradually fortress conservation actually has been somewhat inefficient in elephant conservation, at least. I say somewhat inefficient. This is a very theory-based podcast. I haven't got a load of stats for you. A lot of this is coming from various other books that I've read about elephants. So I've recently read Among the Elephants by Ian Douglas Hamilton and Oria Douglas Hamilton, and they've got quite a nuanced view on it. So if we look at elephant population kind of demographics and demographic history, we can really start when Europeans turned up in Africa, because that's when we can have reliable population estimates. Unfortunately, because they were keeping them for shooting purposes, and so after the Europeans essentially pitched up in Africa and nicked a load of countries, elephant populations plummeted because Europeans turned up with guns and quite heavy-duty rifles. And so elephants were lost first in North Africa, then in West Africa when the slave trade really penetrated in there. It wasn't just slaves, it was ivory as well they were trading. They were driven entirely extinct in southern Africa, apart from these tiny, tiny pockets. And when Europeans penetrated north of the Zambezi, the slaughter continued in central and eastern Africa as well. Phase 2, and I'm kind of going through this in phases because it's really essential, I think, to understand these phases if we're going to look at fortress conservation, is once actually elephant numbers plummeted, the European colonial administrations realised they'd have to protect them if they wanted to continue hunting them. So colonial protection was established, game reserves and national parks were established, and elephant numbers actually rose quite rapidly. And so it might be quite tempting to think that this was just because, national parks. But actually, another favourable at this time, sorry, completely muddled up my words there. Another favourable thing at this time was a vast rinderpest pandemic, which spread across East Africa, and it killed millions of ungulates.
It decimated wildebeest, I think in particular. It was just,
absolutely, wildebeest were
huge
whacked.
declines.
But also domestic livestock, and for pastoralist peoples like the Maasai, it was a massive tragedy, and because their cows are their livelihood, it's the cornerstone of their culture, and they actually abandoned thousands of square miles of prime pasture. Because they were no longer maintained as grassland, these pastures reverted to forest, which is prime elephant habitat. And in a lot of areas, the Maasai actually haven't reclaimed these areas because the forests brought with them the tsetse fly, which brought sleeping sickness and malaria, none of which affect elephants, incidentally. So you can see this in Murchison Falls National Park in Uganda, was originally pasture, which then the Maasai left because of this sickness, and the elephants took it. And so this created a kind of perfect elephant heyday in the I say heyday, shifting baseline syndrome. They're clearly far less than they were before. They were rebounding at the beginning of the 19th century. The third phase of elephant history, and the current one, begins just after this. So modern medicine comes in, the end of slavery, broadly a cessation of intertribal warfare, and so human populations expand. And so the current phase of elephant demography is one of restriction and compression into ever smaller ranges. And this is probably helped by the fact that they can teach each other which areas are safe. And so they will tell each other that, okay, these national parks and these game reserves are safe through their social structure. And they can teach others this. And so they are all gradually being contracted into these areas. And so that's where we are at now, with essentially national parks and game reserves are the elephant's only remaining habitat. So they're these islands in a sea of humanity. And this actually is quite a big problem because it interrupts something which we call habitat cycling. And so this is, for me, an interesting shortcoming of fortress conservation.
I think, I don't know, this idea of habitat cycling, it just shows you how we always look at the world in like a very snapshot view of the world, of like a habitat exists like on its own as it is now, with no consideration of how it can change and how wildlife can change it. So basically, owing to human population expansion, national parks and game reserves are kind of now the elephant's only refuge. So they're kind of these islands in this sea of humanity, because humans are everywhere. And so not only is this kind of preventing the elephants from wandering, they're also kind of swelled by the invasion of these kind of refugee elephants, so to speak, which are fleeing to safety from other areas. This, like you kind of said, Robi, it is a big problem. And we've talked about elephants before in previous podcasts. They're incredible ecosystem engineers, and their presence kind of drives the African savanna forest cycle. So it's them that are causing these big cyclical changes in the ecosystem. So just to explain what this is, this savanna forest cycle. So elephants, if you've seen them on documentaries or in real life, if you were privileged enough to do so, elephants kind of, they rumble. I'm trying to think of the verb. They knock down trees and bushes. They're very, very powerful. And they establish grasslands in their place, so where they've cleared down these scrubs and trees. And so grassland is kind of subpar elephant habitat. So their numbers decline once the land turns to grassland, and they'll move on. And so now grasslands are burning every year, which is preventing the regeneration of young trees and also forming healthy grassland communities. So if you have all these grasslands, this provides ideal grazing conditions for ungulates, so all your huge herds of wildebeest and zebra and all your other herbivorous grazers that you get. Yeah,
Topi are my favourite new ungulates. I love a topi.
Topi are great. And so what can happen is that these ungulates can breed and graze so much that they actually strip the grass bare. And then you start to get patches of soil emerging, untouched by the fire, and trees and bushes sprout on kind of these islands. And if you have no browsers to suppress them, woodlands then proliferate and become ideal again for elephants. So kind of 100 years after it began, the cycle just comes back full circle and the elephants return to their demolition. So it's like a savanna...
Demolition elephants.
Yeah. But it's like this continuous cycle between savanna and grasslands.
And it's kind of... This is a healthy cycle, and I think what we forget is that the Serengeti was not always these vast plains. That's relatively young, and Tarangire next door was not always a vast scrub forest. In time, under natural circumstances, the Serengeti will become forest again, and Tarangire will become plains again. As the elephants, they cause this cycle. And it's this constant movement of megafauna and browsers and grazers switching places in and out that drives this cycle. But once you create a national park and you put up a fence, all of this natural cycling stops.
Yeah. Because you couldn't, I guess that would restrict their movements massively in terms of if there is an area, like we were saying, with once they've cleared the shrubs and the grassland habitat emerges, they'll then move on because that's less optimal. So I think we kind of touched on this, but kind of national parks are too often managed as a snapshot in time. So in Murchison Falls, is that how you say it?
Murchison Falls. I think it's got another name now. I think it's reverted back to a local name, but I actually don't know what that is off the top of my head.
Okay.
So I think people do still call it Murchison Falls.
Okay. So Murchison Falls is a national park in Uganda, and here thousands of elephants were culled by park ranger Richard Laws because it was feared that the elephants were knocking down all the trees and were forming a grassland. So this was actually a concern for the national park. But we now understand that ecosystems with megafauna they're constantly in flux. They're always changing, and you can't just manage it as a snapshot because, like you say, you're going to get this cycle, and you can't just treat it as bad when they start clearing down, knocking down the trees.
And they were so scared that they were just going to lose all their forest in Murchison, they culled all these elephants. But actually, later on in the I think it was the late 1970s, they re-looked at the evidence and they thought, oh, actually, maybe we just let it happen. And that came out of Ian Douglas Hamilton's study in Manyara National Park. But if you do manage... Sorry,
I was going to say, it's really interesting to kind of hear about it in this context because at the moment we're kind of seeing this phenomenon that's called bush encroachment happening in savanna ecosystems, which is thought to be a response to climate change, where more woody vegetation is growing because it can sequester more carbon. And so there's a kind of fear that we're losing a lot of our grassland habitats, and it's another big kind of question within conservation at the moment is, do we clear this woody vegetation in order to allow grassland habitats and species reliant on that to persist, or do we allow this natural response to climate change to occur? And actually having elephants around kind of means we can do both, because they'll clear it for us in a more natural way and allow grassland to persist, but also allow bush encroachment to keep happening because the elephants will just eat it. So it's weird to hear about kind of getting rid of elephants for doing this habitat cycling when we actually really just, right now, it's becoming a really prevalent question again, just as it was when they started putting these fences up.
And my pet theory, which I've obviously got no evidence for, my pet theory is actually bush encroachment has got nothing to do with climate change. It's to do with the fact that we're shooting all the elephants and the big rhinos and all these things which would otherwise keep the forest down. So you can tell I've just read Ian Douglas Hamilton's biography. Basically, he got sent to Manyara National Park in Tanzania in the 70s because it had the highest density of elephants in Africa. The park wanted him to do a study saying, do we cull these elephants because they're going to knock down the forest? And it had tree climbing lions there, which is why they were like, oh, we need the trees. And the result of his 4-year study was, yeah, they're going to knock down the forest, but that's okay because then they'll all move off, and and 50 years later the forest will come back again. And so he kind of highlighted these cycles. So this whole thing about bush encroachment because of climate change, I'm not convinced it's climate change. I think it's the fact that we've shot most of the elephants, and of course the bush is going to come back because there's nothing to. A grassland only exists if there's something to keep it, to mow the lawn essentially, and to knock down all the trees.
But I guess it's all linked, like we talked about in the climate change episode, that it's the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis come hand in hand. So if you start altering the composition of wildlife in that area, that is ultimately going to affect the climate in the long term because of the cycles. But no, I do agree with that.
And I guess, for the conservation sector, in particular where you've got big national parks, you do have to ask, can the healthy ecological cycles continue, or will they just break down under pressure? And I've been talking a lot about East Africa because that's the one I know best. But I think this kind of line of thought really only applies itself to these kind of dynamic, megafaunal driven ecosystems. Somewhere like a rainforest, I think a national park is a completely fantastic idea because it's a stable rainforest. It's not constantly changing its habitat. Although I suppose it may have been once upon a time when South America had loads of megafauna too. Maybe the Amazon is an artificial construct because we killed all the gomphotheres. Ooh, I smell a PhD.
It does make you think, doesn't it? It's like what the ecosystems that we have now today. That is what we've grown. This is again that shifting baseline syndrome. It's what we used to, and we see these pristine areas of wilderness. We're going to explore that that term a bit more, but maybe they weren't always like that, and they are always changing. And I think we have to be okay with that.
Yeah, and mad if the Amazon is actually a human construct because we killed all the South American mega mammals. That would be terrifying if that was the case. But that's a nice segue because how has fortress conservation affected our idea of wilderness? So again, I'm going to kind of use two parks in East Africa, Serengeti and Ngorongoro, as an example. So, Serengeti National Park, vast, pristine wilderness with wildebeest, jumping, and crocodiles jumping, and lions, and it's the plains, and it's the Lion King, and it's everything. Is it actually a wilderness, though? Is what we're going to think. What do you think? I mean, I know it's a bit of a biased question because I'm going to be talking about it, so...
I mean, I think it's a hard one. I think in terms of the space that is available on our planet currently, I would say yes, that it is a wild space, but there may be other things we need to consider. Is that right?
Well, it's an interesting little bit of contrarianism. So, okay, Serengeti, wilderness, that's what we're going to think about. So our lineage as a species has been in the Serengeti area for at least 4 million years, because fossils of Australopithecines have been found there. The Maasai people have been grazing their livestock in the eastern plains around 200 years before the first Europeans ever turned up and said, "Ooh, look, that could be a national park." So in the decades that followed, the area was used for lion hunting. When the lions became scarce, the British colonial administration made it a partial game reserve, and by 1951 it had become a national park. In 1959, to preserve wildlife, the British evicted the resident Maasai and moved them to the nearby Ngorongoro conservation area. So there's a lot of controversy around this move, as there should be, because the Maasai were just living there beforehand and then they got kicked out.
Yeah.
And so now human habitation is actually forbidden in the park, with the exception of the park's authority people, researchers, and Safari Lodge staff. But I quite like this example because it does kind of show us how susceptible we are to the own kind of mystique that we make. Humans have lived in the Serengeti for thousands of years, and it's only become a wilderness in the way that we think of wilderness in the last half century, when the colonial powers kicked out the people who'd lived there for centuries.
But I think an interesting point to make with wilderness is we always just associate it with non-human animals, whereas we are part of the natural world. We happen to have created this artificial society for ourselves and built these complex structures, but we are still a part of that wilderness. We are still in the animal grouping, whether we like some people want to admit that or not.
This is the whole thing with fortress conservation, is it's very separationist and very we've isolated ourselves from nature, and we've gone, nature wild can't be wild if humans are there. When, as you say, our lineage has been in this area for millions of years, and we came out of Africa in the same way
and
a
this
lot of
part
other
of
species
Africa.
did. Yeah, and this specific part of Africa as well. So it is this quite new thinking that we're separate from nature.
There was quite a nice comparison that I saw recently with humans and elephants, and they said, okay, so the African bush elephant, Loxodonta africana, is only about the same age as we are as a species. First emerged around 2 million years ago. So that's quite an interesting, we're the same age as the elephants. Because, you hear in the documentaries, it's always, the elephant has roamed Africa since the beginning of time. Well, actually, so have we.
Yeah.
And it does kind of play into a kind of mystique that we have where Africa is this kind of dark continent.
Yeah.
Which is completely kind of bonkers. And we always say it's vast, uninhabited. Well, it's only uninhabited because we displaced or killed the people who were inhabiting it in the first place.
I think we look at that from the wrong angle on both sides. Like, we think of elephants as this really like old and wise and like majestic creature that's lived for millions of years and stuff, and we think of ourselves as very new. So we're both wrong. Like, we're kind of, I mean, I guess that you could say that elephants are long, but you can't think both simultaneously. And I think we forget that modern humans and the Homo sapiens that were around, however many years ago, are the same. We're the same species. And I think we think that with the Industrial Revolution and the technological revolution, we sort of changed fundamentally as a species, when biologically we just didn't really. So we're not this kind of like new shiny thing. We've actually been here for a really long time.
I love that.
And also, the reason Africa is the only continent to keep the majority of its megafauna is because we co-evolved with that megafauna. We co-evolved for the African ecosystem. I also don't want to fall into a kind of a more modern tendency, which is to kind of fetishize indigenous peoples, which would come under a kind of noble savage concept, like they lived in harmony with nature and they could do no wrong. All human societies, including agriculturalists, have some measurable impact on the ecosystem. So the Maasai burn pastures, they can overgraze areas, but we can be 100% certain that the impacts of the Maasai 50 to 100 years ago are far smaller than the impacts that we have had on our own ecosystems in the past. Where are our wolves and bears and bison and mammoths and moose, I would ask. Sorry, I get very annoyed because we don't have any bears, bison, wolves, mammoths and moose. And again, this tale continues into Ngorongoro, where I've been lucky enough to visit. It's this incredible place. It's literally a crater. It's a massive volcanic crater with a lake in the middle.
It looks incredible. Never been, but
we should go. You stand on the edge and you look in, and it's just wildebeest. And the only ever rhino I've ever seen in the wild, the African rhino, was there, and it was a tiny speck far off in the distance.
That's amazing.
But, you think of Ngorongoro, World Heritage Site, one of the great natural wonders of Africa. Ish. Because the Mbulu and the Datuga peoples have lived there for at least 2,000 years. The Maasai were also in the crater. And then in 1951, a load more Maasai were brought in from the Serengeti by the British colonial authorities. What I found really interesting is that Ngorongoro itself is actually an onomatopoeic name for the sound of cowbells. Ngorongoro, when they ring.
That's wow! I didn't know that. That's really cool.
I didn't know that.
And I was like, oh my god, my mind is blown.
Yeah.
And the same things are happening with fortress conservation in Ngorongoro. So, 2009, the Wildlife Conservation Act further restricted human use of the crater, and there was allegations that it created a framework to disenfranchise and displace traditional pastoralists. And all this does is creates tension between the people who live there and the park authorities. And we know, because we talk about conservation a lot, that tension is never helpful. And in 2015, the Maasai were actually forbidden from grazing in the crater. So they were living in the Serengeti, then they were kicked out, moved to Ngorongoro, then they were living there, and now they've been kicked out from their grazing there. So where are they going to go? And so that is kind of a little discussion for you on on how fortress conservation has human impacts as well as animal impacts.
I just think in my mind that raises a really interesting question, that we're only considering wild spaces like to be fully wilderness if we remove people. And it's kind of not acknowledging the fact that these communities were displaced, there was a huge amount of conflict there, but it's okay because now they're wild because humans can't touch it. It's something doesn't quite sit right there with the idea of that wilderness.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, for a bit of balance, do we want to do some of the pros now of fences, fortress conservation, just to kind of make sure we're not leaning too heavily before we get to the discussion?
Yeah, we do love a pros and cons on this podcast. So.
Yes,
We really do.
So there are obviously some positives about fences. I don't think people just put them up willy-nilly without any forethought. I think there was some. And obviously the first one that's quite obvious is sanctuary. So fencing off areas and preventing people from entering them or living there was kind of giving priority to wildlife and acknowledging the need for wildlife to have sanctuary areas. It always comes back to the question of does that need to be human free or not? But I think it did show this thinking of, we actually do need to do something to protect wildlife, and putting wildlife and natural space at the kind of centre of thought. So I think it was probably very well intentioned originally. And it obviously, fences do and always have provided some level of protection to wildlife. So poaching is a significant threat to several wildlife species, and it is the kind of primary cause of decline in certain species like the pangolin or rhinos. And fences, and especially electrified fences, can provide some protection from poaching to these animals. So creating a barrier between people and wildlife does mean that it's harder for poachers to get to the wildlife because they have to transverse this barrier now. And when you're kind of discussing particular electric fences, this is an additional risk that poachers now have to weigh up and do their kind of cost benefit analysis, and is potentially getting electrocuted on this fence worth it, or trying to transverse an electric fence. In reality, there are obviously many ways to get across a fence, and
I have jumped many fences in my time.
Yeah, you can climb them. I'm not going to go through it because I don't know who's listening, but it would be ridiculous to say if you put up a fence, therefore no one can get it, because we all know that that's not true. But they can act as a deterrent. They also do establish kind of clear boundaries, which makes it easier for rangers and reserve managers and anti-poaching units to patrol their land and kind of keep a better tabs of going on. And even though obviously we all know there's ways to get, through a fence, you will tend to leave a trace if you're breaking in somewhere through a fence, especially if it's an electric fence. So that's also another way that kind of rangers and anti-poaching guides can monitor poaching easily and possibly collect evidence, because they will see where the breakages are coming from, if they leave anything behind, if you get caught on the fence at all, then you're going to leave a trace, and that can be quite useful for catching poachers and at least monitoring kind of weak spots in your area. So I think fences can be quite useful for just establishing boundaries and allowing you to keep better tabs on what's going on. Another kind of pro of fences is they keep, as well as keeping people out, they keep livestock out. And livestock grazing is another major factor driving biodiversity loss around the world. And so encroachment on natural habitat by livestock and the kind of problems that come with it, like competition for resources, overgrazing, potential spread of disease, can be prevented by fences. And though fences can be circumvented by determined humans, they are they're quite hard. It's, a person can get through it, but I don't think a cow's going to have as much luck. So
I've met some plucky cows in my time.
Yeah, I mean, never say never, but that I think is another kind of key point, that they allow for this separation of not just people and wildlife, but domesticated wildlife and not just livestock, even pets. There's a big problem in with the African wildcat, and probably most wildcat, the Scottish wildcat as well, of breeding with domestic cats and this kind of hybrid species, and then the loss of genetic diversity within the species. And again, a fence isn't going to do much with a cat, but with kind of other species, it prevents this interbreeding of domestic and wild animals. So those are kind of the main pros of fences that we came up with. As we said, we love a pros and cons. So Emma, do you want to rattle through some cons?
Yeah, I think we've probably touched on a couple of these cons already, but one of the big ones that springs to mind is just the impact you have on genetics of kind of wild populations, because fences, especially like you were saying, Kate, with these hardcore kind of electric fences, they are barriers to movement. Although not always, like animals can be remarkably intelligent, and there's this incredible video where they put up an electric fence to try and stop elephants going under, and the elephants literally just crawl under and like drop on all fours. Yeah,
and elephants have been known to take a serious hit of electricity to just storm through a fence.
It's just tank the hit.
Remarkable. It's remarkably impressive. Like, realistically, if an elephant wants to go somewhere, there is nothing you can do about it.
There's this fantastic video on YouTube. I think I assume somewhere maybe east South Africa. So there's an elephant trying to get through a fence. It touches it with its trunk, gets a zap, and it sits there for about 10 minutes. And you can see it. I mean, it's not doing this, but if it had its trunk and it was twirling its moustache. And then it goes around. It finds a tree next to the fence and just pushes it over onto the fence and just walks on over, flicking its tail.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens. Lawrence Anthony documents it in his book as well. A very similar thing where the elephant touches the fence, realises it's electric, and then he kind of puts its trunk without touching it along the fence to try and find a weak spot in it can like sense the current, tries to find a weak spot, and then just barges straight through it. And just rips it down, and it does it twice in 2 days or something, because then they go and get it, bring it back, fix the fence, it just does it again. So it's the amount of electricity that it is taking. And there's other animals. Eland is the biggest antelope in Africa. Massive thing. Looks like a cow. Absolutely huge. They can jump like 2 meters in the air, and they have been seen to just jump over these massive fences. And sometimes you'll be driving along. I've been in this experience before where you're driving along inside a reserve, and you see the eland on the other side, and the guys are like, oh yeah, they just go over if the grass literally looks greener, and then they'll come back. They just jump, and you're just like, okay. I mean, again, unless you're putting up ridiculously high fences, which is very expensive and largely unnecessary, there's nothing you can do.
And I think that's quite those are two quite good examples, elephants and elands, just because we designed the fence to keep our livestock enclosed and predators on outside. We didn't design the fence, whenever humans design the fence, to keep out 10-ton African elephants which can just walk all over it. And I think that's, it's quite interesting because I've completely forgotten what I'm going to say. I'm going to stop. I had a thing and it just went. It vanished.
Or if it comes back, just jump in. But as clever as animals are, and they can get around it, these fences do provide some kind of barrier compared to if there was nothing there. And if you can't have these populations of wild animals mixing, then you can get populations becoming isolated, they can become inbred, and that can have really negative consequences for the overall fitness of populations. So we've seen that time and time again with kind of isolation or speciation, which can occur when populations can't mix with each other. And we've also discussed translocations in previous podcasts, and this has often been used as a solution to this. To kind of allow animals to mix in different areas. And essentially translocating animals can be a way to mimic what would normally be a natural process through migration and movement. But like we kind of mentioned, there's considerations there like ethical and the trauma of translocation, and will they establish themselves in the new area? It's not always that easy. And then I guess another con is exclusion and removal of people. So one of the main criticisms of fortress conservation is that it's forcing people to move from where they're living and vacate the area in order to conserve it, in kind of air quotations if you're listening to this, purely for wildlife. So often, like you were saying with some of the examples, Robi, kind of the Maasai and the tribal groups, these are communities that have been living side by side with wildlife for generations. And like we said, it's not perfect. Their relationship with the natural world isn't, by all means, kind of this perfect example of how you should live. Is still wrong, I think, the displacement aspect.
It's also, it's a poor sort of business decision within conservation, which I think stems from the fact that a lot of this was happening in, the colonialist era in sort of the 1950s and stuff, and it obviously has incredibly problematic and racist roots to it. But the people that were displaced are probably the most valuable in some ways people to conservation management today, because they've been living side by side with wildlife generations. They know so much more about the land, about the wildlife, than the people who displaced them. And someone like me going over and doing research would benefit so much from the local Indigenous knowledge. And it's something that I think we're realising more and more now in conservation, that local Indigenous knowledge is unrivaled, and we really, really need this collaborative approach. And it was just a really bad idea, because now there's conflict, rightly so, because of these kind of exclusions that were put in place however many years ago and are still actively happening today, when really the knowledge that they have is incredibly valuable to conservation.
On that kind of note, if you're not persuaded by the moral and the ethical views, and I would be slightly worried if you weren't, there is also an economic argument in that if you're sending scientists and park rangers and wardens from not in the local area to go and study and conserve this wildlife, you've got to fund them, and sooner or later the money will run out. Whereas if it's the local people who live there, kind of not necessarily taking the lead, although I would like to, they should be, but if they're involved, their funding isn't going to run out because they live there. And so you've got a relatively sustainable model in terms of keeping the work going. And so I can't remember who it was. It was on, I think it was on Instagram, and someone was doing this thing. She's like, yeah, we have to fund it, but they might not necessarily have to. And so if you're looking for a model where you can actually prolong conservation for as long as possible, involving the people who actually live there is going to give you far longer to actually save these species than other people.
No, just kind of adding on to that, the idea of if you're going to prolong conservation, you kind of want to have a good relationship with the people who are actually living there, because if they were forced out of their land and they now have restricted livestock grazing areas, they're going to be very unwilling to get involved and want to help out if that was a massive root cause of tension and displacement. So I think we'll talk a bit more later about some ways that we can actually involve local people in a more healthy way. And I guess just a couple other kind of cons which link in, but just if we think about a lot of the wildlife we're talking about, they have massive ranges and they need these big territorial areas to be able to fulfill all kind of their natural behaviours and find a mate and do all their scent marking and things like that. And you massively restrict the range as soon as you have these big physical borders. That's gonna... I don't know how much it's already altering kind of the natural behaviours, because I know with some species they've now had to remove individuals when they get to a certain beyond the carrying capacity, because the space just can't support that many, because there'd be too much territorial conflict. And then just overall lack of connectivity, I think, is the key thing, which conservationists have kind of highlighted is important for a while, that we need landscapes connected, and you can't just have these isolated pockets like when we did the palm oil episode talking about those isolated areas. It's just doesn't work.
And I think bouncing off of that, the one that springs to mind when we talk about lack of connectivity is the Sumatran Rhino, which is, it's in the name, only found in Sumatra, although it used to be found all over Southeast Asia and we forget that. But it's now only found in, I think, 3 national parks in Sumatra: Gunung Lusa, Waikambas, and maybe Bukit Barisan. But if you look at where these parks are on a map, they're hundreds and hundreds of miles away from each other. So you've got one in the top corner, one down there, and Wakambas is right down at the bottom. And you think, okay, well, great, we've got 30 rhinos between us. How on earth are they going to mix? And you just think, unless you have a corridor, unless you have somewhere, and maybe we do it artificially, maybe we translocate, although good luck finding a Sumatran rhino in the swamps. It's going to be impossible, that species is somewhat doomed, I think.
And I think as well with connectivity, it's important to remember that I think your head automatically jumps to an animal like the rhino. But this is also a problem for species that are incredibly mobile. It's even a problem in the oceans, but I'm thinking kind of specifically about birds. You kind of think, oh, it doesn't matter so much birds. They can just fly from one green patch to another. But actually, birds can't just fly and fly and fly. Not all bird species migrate from Africa to England every year. Some species, the kind of range of movement is not that big. And so if you've got two national parks, on different sides of the country, you might think, oh, the birds can just fly. But they can't. And they need patches of habitat in which to take rest, to feed, to nest if they're, I don't know, breeding at that time. It's it's not just for something like an ungulate or a lion or something. It's not just these big animals that can't also intermix with people. It's also animals like birds that can very much be in a town and not pose a massive threat to us, but they need to be able to take rest and have these patches of habitat. And so the lack of connectivity is just a really big problem across the board, really.
Like a pheasant couldn't fly from Wakambas to going loose. Like, how's it going to do? You ever seen a pheasant flying more than 10 feet?
No.
Yeah.
If you startle
exactly.
it.
And it's not a question of the pheasant then just taking a little break on the side of the road. Like they need somewhere where they can get what they need.
It's just playing cards, waiting for the traffic to pass.
With a little howl.
So, Robi, how much do you love tea?
Can I quantify? I love tea a lot, as much as I love, pine martins.
Exactly, me too. I love tea, and that's really lucky we do, because this episode is actually being sponsored by the amazing tea company called Animal Tea.
Ooh.
And they make sustainable, organic, pesticide-free loose tea.
All of my favourite things.
Exactly, and what's more, it tastes really, really good. And do you want to know the best part of Animal Tea?
I would have thought the best part is that it's sustainable, organic, pesticide-free, but there's more. Tell me more.
There is more. They give away 100% of their profits to wildlife charities to support species like pangolins, lions, and primates.
So where can I get more? Because I will be drinking lots and lots.
Yeah, so if you want more tea, Robi, or anyone listening wants some tea, so you just head to the website animaltea.com. So that's ANIMALL and then TEA.com to place an order. And what's more is that you, as Biome Podcast listeners, get 15% off the total order by entering the code Biome. So that's BIOME at the checkout. So if you use our Biome code, you can order some of this incredible tea and join me and Robi on our tea drinking adventure.
Our tea journey.
Exactly. So go out and drink tea, and we're going to head back to the podcast now.
See you next time. So we're going to kind of talk about some alternatives now to this fortress conservation model. Obviously, Emma mentioned translocations there. It's not really an alternative. It's more something that can be used alongside this to kind of make it slightly better. Basically, as Emma said, it just allows you to kind of mimic the natural process by moving animals manually, basically, from one place to another. We discussed translocations quite heavily in our culling episode, so we won't go into it again too much. So if you want to learn more, definitely check that episode out. Cheeky little plug thrown in there.
I love it.
So another kind of alternative to fences that, again, nothing's a full alternative because I think a lot of these things would still involve some form of fencing, but we want to talk about transfrontier conservation areas. So these are basically designated conservation areas, much like any kind of other national park, but they cross over national or political borders. So an example is the Kalahari Transfrontier Park, which is in both South Africa and Botswana, and the border is in the park. So because of changes in global politics brought about through globalization, and because many natural spaces and wildlife are subject to international forces and forms of management, there is this kind of increasing need for global environmental governance. Because both globalization and our kind of shrinking world, as well as the fact that, for example, burning fossil fuels in one country has the impacts the global climate, so has an impact on natural space in another country, global management sort of makes sense. Since ecosystems also cross these borders that we created, it makes sense for the conservation and management of said ecosystems to also cross over these borders. The power of science is kind of often argued
Power of science.
Yeah, science is kind of argued to legitimise political policy interventions. And so the growing field of conservation biology, my field, provides the scientific rationale for transboundary environmental management, which is really exciting and really cool, I think.
There's another one in South Africa, isn't there? Isn't Kruger part of a big one up with Mozambique?
I think Kruger goes across Mozambique. There's quite a few in Africa, in southern Africa in general. I think there's a couple in South Africa. I think there might be one with Namibia as well. The Kalahari is like the biggest, I think, or the kind of most famous for being transboundary. But there's some that cross over 3 countries in southern Africa, and it's not just in Africa. There are other parts of the world that have this.
I guess Serengeti and Masai Mara are connected. It's Masai Mara in Kenya, Serengeti in Tanzania, but it's one big
loop. Exactly. There's no border, like physical border across the border. They are technically 2 parks, but it is transboundary.
And in Latin America as well, I think when we talked about the Jaguar Corridor, we did the Jaguar Corridor episode, there's an initiative there, a collaboration between multiple countries recognising that they need this corridor between you can't just take the line on a map as the political boundary and be like, oh well, the animals will respect this political border. Like, you need to have some leeway there.
Could you imagine if there was a guy sitting there with a passport and every time a gazelle goes over, stamp?
Yeah,
Stamp.
I know.
1.5 million wildebeest, 1.5 million stamps.
And it is quite funny. When I was in the Masai Mara, this was years ago, we were hoping to see a cheetah, and they had a cheetah that I think had a radio collar, so they knew roughly where she was, and they were like, okay, she's quite far, so if we want to go, like, it's gonna be like we drive there and go. And then they just got a message, oh, we can't go, she's gone into Tanzania, and she'd crossed the border and gone into Tanzania. We can't just follow her. We were like, she doesn't need a passport. But transfrontier conservation areas are intended to restore this connectivity that we were discussing between parts of an ecosystem through the migration corridors for wildlife. And they allow natural migratory routes and for wildlife to also establish larger populations through the creation of larger protected areas, which is also really cool. Unsurprisingly, local communities have been identified as a key stakeholder in making transfrontier conservation work. And community-based natural resource management has been really critical in justifying the creation or the kind of switch to transboundary conservation areas. So these communities should both drive the management and also derive direct benefits from this. So, for example, revenue from tourism. And proponents of transfrontier conservation suggest that these areas involve a return to more kind of culturally relevant boundaries as well. So, sticking with Southern Africa as an example, a number of Southern African ethnic groups extend across national boundaries, because a lot of the national boundaries in Southern Africa, or in Africa in a whole, were established by Europeans who didn't take cultural boundaries into much consideration, if any consideration, when establishing these boundaries. So many communities have been dislocated or split up by these national borders. So therefore, transfrontier conservation actually has the potential to re-establish these boundaries that are closer to cultural boundaries that were originally there. On the flip side, some kind of negatives. One issue is that the areas that have been identified as sites for transfrontier conservations, they're not empty, but they're actually filled with obviously multiple networks that are equally interested in gaining access and control. So you can't just grab a place that's got a diverse mix of people and stuff going on in it and say, like, whose is it? Because it's got several different cultures, several different groups within that space. So that can be quite tricky. And again, another kind of con, I guess, is the idea that tourism is enough to financially sustain these areas and the surrounding communities is quite problematic, because the idea of establishing a conservation area often means that you're preventing natural resource use within the area, which comes back to this like original idea of fortress conservation, where it's people out, wildlife in. And that often means when you establish a protected area, you put in regulations of what can and cannot be done. And often natural resource use is heavily regulated or forbidden. And by that, I mean kind of going in and chopping down a tree for timber, or picking plants for medicine, or whatever you want to do, hunting as well. And often when you're talking about the local communities who live there in and around these areas, this is subsistence. They're taking these resources because they need them. So when you're preventing this by creating a protected area, you're cutting these communities off from their livelihoods. And I think the justification given is, okay, we're taking that away, but we're giving you revenue from tourism instead. And, you know, you can argue that that's okay, or at least better, because you're directly replacing their income stream. But the problem with tourism, and especially ecotourism, is it's not profitable overnight. And sometimes it can take a really long time to become profitable, because you've got to build the lodges, you've got to get people in, you've got to spend a lot of money up front, and you will start to see a return on your investment probably after a year or so, possibly more. And expecting people to wait for that is not really justified when they've got a perfectly reasonable and, you know, often sustainable or possibly sustainable stream of income already. So I think you'd have to phase it in, and for the, you know, before you start seeing this return on tourism investment, you'd have to allow some subsistence natural resource use to persist. And again, this comes back to making sure that these communities have a seat at the table and are not just there, they're actually key management decision makers from the start. Conservation schemes also typically benefit kind of one type or one section of community over another. And again, this idea that conservation schemes just universally benefit local communities. I think, Robi, you've kind of mentioned this before. It's a fallacy. Like, that's just not how it works. You don't just go in and derive benefit and then it's all just fine. It's a lot more complicated than that.
You can't hold benefit in your hand.
Exactly.
Here, I've got 10 benefits for you.
Exactly. And I think sometimes it's going to be that you can employ a certain group of people and not another, or that you can establish, you know, a stream of income for some people but not everyone, or it's not a one size fits all. And so you can't just say, oh, we're gonna help the local communities and that be the end of it. It doesn't work like that. This is quite a brief. It's not even that brief. I feel like I've been talking for a long time, but in terms of the discussion around transfrontier conservation areas, this is quite a brief introduction, and there is so much more to say, and there is so much interesting discussion going on in the literature. So if you are interested, I really recommend just reading some papers about it. But we just wanted to provide a snapshot into this as this kind of alternative to fences. I think overall, from an ecology perspective, transboundary conservation areas are really beneficial, and they do overcome a lot of the challenges that we've kind of set out that are previously caused by fortress conservation and kind of ecosystem isolation. But as is often the case, as we keep saying, conservation is as much about people as it is wildlife, probably more. And these areas definitely aren't perfect from that angle, and they definitely present overall, I think, a mix of promise and challenge. And again, I think it just comes back to management and how you're going to manage them.
I still think they're a good idea.
I do as well.
I like it's a nice way of thinking about things. It's not just our problem and that country's problem. We've got the same problem. Let's fix it together.
I think just in life, we need to move away from this attitude of us and them, because even when we're talking about wildlife, it's always us on the pedestal, and all the other wildlife is like, oh well, but it's there for us to exploit it. It's like, if we just, like with this idea of working between countries and actually having collaboration, it's the same issues that you're trying to solve. It's the same things that you're working towards. But just because there's a line that was drawn on a map, I don't think that should stop people from working together and trying to actually work on this as like collaboratively. I said that really weird.
I agree. I think as well, given where we are now, I think the idea of global environmental governance I really like. When you kind of think about the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, these are global issues that are being caused. You know, everyone's got a stake and everyone's also got, you know, a contribution. Everyone's got a carbon footprint and everyone is going to be impacted by climate change. Obviously, there's massive disparity and inequality within that, but these problems are kind of globally shared. And so the idea that we're going to solve them nationally doesn't make sense. And I think transboundary conservation isn't trying to save the world. We're not trying to, you know, it's not going to fix climate change or fix the global biodiversity crisis, but this acknowledgement of global governance when it comes to environmental issues, I think is going to become more and more prevalent as we move forward, while we're acknowledging the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And so I think it's a good start in recognising that national borders mean pretty much nothing when it comes to the environment.
I just had a thingy. It's a metaphor. National borders is fortress conservation. It's non-sustainable in terms of dealing with the same issue. You've got to have connectivity. Got it. Done it.
You cracked it, Robi.
The whole time you were speaking, it was in my head, and I was like, hang on. This is a metaphor, and then it came out. It makes sense. If you've got one problem, Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa, if only one of them solves the problem, then you know you've got isolated populations. It's not going to benefit the species as a whole. And it's a whole species being us.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel like that was just within me for so long, and it was just. Sorry, I'm good now.
And it's like the Paris Agreement did this well. That it was a global decision, but each country has their target, and it's also it's a big thing in the oceans, that the oceans are a kind of tragedy of the commons often, because it's common. A lot of it is just common land, common ocean,
or even not land.
Which is, we see this tragedy of the commons that we obviously discussed in the fishing episode, but we also have designated parts of the ocean that belong to different countries, and some of them are really randomly displaced. And you kind of need this like global management of the ocean. So you have the high seas that are no man's land, and they have to be kind of globally managed. And I just think it's really interesting. Moving away from transfrontier conservation areas, another kind of alternative to fences, but also not really, is these wilderness areas that we have previously mentioned. So obviously, as we said, a wilderness area is just an area where the land is in a natural state and human intervention or activities are minimal or regulated or non-existent entirely. Some wilderness areas exist inside national parks that are not wholly wilderness, if that makes sense. So an example is Shosholo and Mfolozi in South Africa, which is in KwaZulu-Natal, and they
say that 10 times faster.
Shosholo and Mfolozi. I don't think I can do it 10 times. They have an area in the park that is wilderness, and you're not allowed, no vehicles are allowed to drive through it. The only people that are allowed in it are rangers, and they're on foot. But the rest of the park is a kind of normal national park. You can drive around and go on game drives. So they have this kind of sanctuary within the wider park. So there are 24 wilderness areas, which cover over 1 million hectares, and they are over 70% intact, and they have human densities of less than or equal to 5 people per kilometre squared. So this wilderness covers 44% of all land, but is inhabited only by 3% of people. All of those stats that I just gave were from a paper that was published in 2003, so they might be a bit different now. That is quite an old paper, but it was kind of the kind of best paper discussing wilderness that I could find.
Is that a global wilderness? Is that like there are the 1 million hectares? Is that kind of around the world? Okay,
that's around the world, I think.
So 44% of all land on Earth is technically wilderness area.
Yes, but that sounds really great.
It sounds amazing, but
I was reading it, I was like, that's not true.
Yeah.
But Antarctica, pretty much the whole thing is a wilderness area. The Gobi Desert, pretty much the whole thing.
I'm sensing a theme here. These are all deserts.
So this is the thing. Yeah, so I'll come to that in a sec.
Sorry, jumping the gun.
No worries. The idea of wilderness is to give land back to nature and allow natural processes to be the dominant force rather than anthropogenic management. And often these areas still follow a kind of fortress-esque model in that they're established areas with boundaries, but they have the potential to offer sanctuary to wildlife. And they're quite similar in a way to no-take MPAs, as we discussed in our sustainable fishing episode. The areas have the potential to kind of allow species to recover from anthropogenic pressures and then spill over into more managed areas. Some of the big pros of wilderness conservation is they're very cost effective, especially when you incorporate ecosystem services because of the low human population densities. That allows them to be quite cost effective. They're also really large scale, they're generally, and they are long term. They have long term protection. Cons. Most wilderness areas are not very rich in species.
You just said the idea is to give the land back to nature. I don't know that we ever took much land from the Gobi and Antarctica. Like, they're pretty empty to begin with.
Yeah, I think the idea of establishing more would be to give land back to nature. Yeah, that's true. A lot of the ones that are currently there are not because we decided, oh, we'll give this land back. It's because we tried and failed to colonize it. So if you watched Our Planet and you watched the feature on the Bartranian camel, you will have remembered the Gobi Desert and the footage they have of it, and it was just this vast ecosystem with no one there, and it was taking them days to find a camel, and there was something like 300 camels in this entire landscape. That's kind of what a lot of the wilderness areas that we have look like. So only 18% of plants and 10% of terrestrial vertebrates are endemic to these wilderness spaces. So that's, a big problem with them is, although they're there, they're not very species rich. And so I think it's important to consider them and obviously to apply some level of protection to them for global conservation. But we obviously must also continue to prioritise biodiversity hotspots and areas with high levels of endemism.
Endemism.
Yeah.
Endemism.
Sounds like an embolism. But...
How do I... Continue to prioritise areas of high endemism and that are rich in species. Another this is a bit more of an alternative to fences, is the creation of habitat corridors. Another kind of strategy that can be used alongside fences or to improve the fortress conservation model are the creation of habitat corridors. And these basically are exactly what they sound like. They are just corridors of habitat that allow connectivity between two areas. And they can take very different forms depending on what animal you're trying to establish the corridor for, or what kind of area you're working with. So they can range from being a literal stretch of land that connects two places. Those are quite rare, but a habitat corridor, as you would kind of imagine it in your head, they can be something as simple as an underpass under a road or under a railway that allows animals to kind of safely get across. You can also get ropes. I've seen this before in some countries where you have ropes coming across roads from one tree to another that allow primates and other like rodents and stuff to cross the road safely. When you're talking about something like birds, it can be simple as just patches from one national park to another, kind of equally spaced out. And you can actually create your own habitat corridor by using your garden if you plant endemic species and create a kind of habitat for birds that allows them to move across. In Cape Town, there was a really big initiative about this with local schools to create gardens of fynbos, which is the endemic biome to the Western Cape, to allow fynbos birds to move across the city safely. And allow them to take refuge in these little patches, and it can literally just be your garden, which is why it's really important as well to stock your garden with endemic species and not non-endemic plant species. So habitat corridors are a really cool way
we
to
love
just allow...
corridors. I'm a massive corridor fan.
Yeah, I think again they're not a solution to fortress conservation if that's what you're looking for, but they make fortress conservation so much better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we also talked about that quite extensively in the Jaguar corridors episode, so check that one out. That's a cool, like you were saying, Kate, it doesn't have to be a continuous stretch of a corridor. It's like these stepping stones working with local people to allow the jaguars to keep moving, which is pretty awesome. And then another interesting one, because Robi and I did a project about bats at university.
Love a bat.
We love bats.
I actually do love bats.
And
I'm not just saying that.
But we were looking at these things called linear landscape elements. So these are things like hedgerows or river systems and things like that, which allow movement and foraging and connectivity. They're great. And one main example of that is hedges, which, like you said, Kate, in our gardens, that's something that we can do. And interesting, I was talking, because my partner's from Belgium, and they were saying that in Belgium, you aren't allowed, if you own a house or a property, you're not allowed to enclose the area with hardcore fences.
I love this.
It's not allowed. And so what you have to do instead is you have to plant hedgerows. So this is discouraging people from building these large fences, and it's also helping wildlife and increasing the number of linear landscape elements in cities, and just I think it's a good idea.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
like we were saying, I think the fences argument we've kind of talked about so far is very much these large expanses like the Serengeti, like Masai Mara, but I think this can also apply hugely in our cities, in urban areas, that we don't always need these hardcore wooden fences. Like, you look out, even out the row of houses out the back of my house, and so many of them have no gaps in them. Like, there's no way that wildlife could ever move along that stretch. And that's a simple thing, I think, that having legislation in place, or I think there's fines in Belgium.
Wow.
If you build a fence, you have to pay a fine if you don't put a hedge, which is pretty cool.
I was going to say that also would work well in agricultural settings, and it was reminding me of land sharing that we discussed in the episode about the
palm oil
diet, I think.
Oh.
I don't.
Two very different takes on that.
I'm not sure. I'll start that again. I feel like that's also something that would work well in agricultural settings, as we discussed in a previous episode, about land sharing and allowing kind of just even hedgerows between fields of crops or of livestock that allow smaller rodents or birds to move through. So yeah, it's something that can be used in kind of any setting, just to simply have a hedge instead of a fence.
Do you know, I think if we tried that here, just knowing as the British people are, I'm sure they'd say, well, no, someone could, hide behind the hedge and jump out. I'm just thinking, oh my God, the headache that it would be to get that implemented. If I was Prime Minister, I'd just do it.
If you think about it, I mean, I would not get through a hedge. Like, this sort of dense...
Wouldn't you?
That is classic.
A dense hedge. A really dense...
Dense.
Like, dense? What am I saying? Dense. A dense... Oh, that's really hard to say. A dense hedge.
Or even
those
a dense...
tall, big ones. Or a dense hedge. I don't know.
Hedge.
It would be... Like, you just wouldn't even try. Like, you'd walk until you could get around it, because you would get so cut up. You just wouldn't get through. You just...
As someone who spends a lot of time clambering over and under hedges to look for badgers, I can guarantee that it's easier to climb over a fence than it is a hedge.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. I mean, obviously some fences are harder to climb over than others, and some fences are designed specifically not to climb over, but the typical fences you see around a field of cows, you can climb that, and if you're a fox, you can run through it, or dig under it or whatever. But a hedge, I'm not getting through a hedge.
Wasn't there a movie, Over the Hedge? Over the
Hedge.
Yeah. Is it Under the Hedge or Over the Hedge? I don't remember which one it was.
Over the hedge.
Over the hedge. Even getting under a hedge is going to be harder than a fence, though, because there's going to be roots and stuff. Like, obviously it's doable and a lot of animals do it, but it's not going to be as easy as getting through a fence.
No, I think hedges are the way to go, I think, especially somewhere like the UK, where we've got a very degraded ecosystem. It's been shown, like you mentioned, Kate, on agricultural land, if farmers were incentivised to either create or maintain things like hedgerows, that already is a beneficial aspect for crop pollination as well, because you're providing habitats for things like insects and other invertebrates, which can then pollinate crops. So it works both ways. And then another cool alternative, which I think Robi and I don't know if we talked about this with you, Kate, before, is about fenceless grazing. So it's a bonkers idea, and I think the article was titled "Musical Cows." Like,
that was it.
It all sounds very bizarre, but it's very. I can see this working, I think. So basically what it means is that it's mainly been tested for livestock, but could be used on a wider scale. And so animals are fitted with these GPS collars, which give them an electric shock when they reach these kind of human-created boundaries. There are no boundaries. You just
like people do with their pets sometimes if they've got a dog that runs away. Yeah.
So the idea is that they get an electric shock if they cross this border, but you have a melody that plays as the animal is approaching this boundary. So the idea is that the animals learn to just associate this melody with, if they go any further, they'll get an electric shock. And it's found to be pretty successful actually with livestock and cattle, that they learn where these boundaries are. There's no fences, there's no anything stopping them from going further other than these musical collars. And so it was the man who runs Knepp Estate,
Charlie Burrell.
Yes. So he said he was massively behind the idea because you could restrict animals where you want them to be without fences, and you also wouldn't need to reintroduce large predators like wolves and things like that to then manage the movement patterns. So say somewhere in the UK, which is very resistant to introducing these large predators, this is a way of controlling, say for deer, for example, controlling where deer can go and things like that. So I can kind of see this technology being used for other animals to keep them out of areas where you don't want them without the need for fences. So I don't know, what do you guys think about it? I think it could be an interesting idea.
I think I see more applications when it comes to keeping livestock out of natural areas than I see applications for keeping wild species out of other areas. Because I think the whole point, the whole problem with the fence is that it restricts natural movement, and this is also doing that. So I think I'd very happily see like all the cows having these collars. That would be quite good, because then you could say, right, don't go into that bit of woodland because we're keeping beavers there or whatever. I don't know if you could switch it the other way. I don't know, because obviously, natural births in the wild, that'd be so hard to put collars on. But I like it as a kind of agricultural add-on.
Yeah, I agree. I think it could work well, but it would depend on what your kind of goal is with it. But I think it would be a nice way to kind of flatten the landscape of fences and allow wildlife to move through without having to lose everything else, without your cattle just wandering around freely and getting lost. So I think it could work quite well in that sense. But I think a big issue is often conflict with certain wildlife. Like, they're happy for, if you've got a field with your sheep in, you could put one of these fences, are fake fences, I don't know what they're called, but you could collar all your sheep, and that would be great if you're happy for certain wildlife to move through, but you still don't want foxes coming in necessarily if you think foxes are going to kill your sheep. So I think it would depend on your purpose and where you are, but I think it's a cool idea, and obviously people have been doing it with their pets for a really long time, so the technology exists, we know that it works, and it could be used almost in training of, like people do to train their dogs.
So the final kind of, I guess you could consider it an alternative to fortress conservation, and this actually is an actual alternative in of itself, and it kind of incorporates all of the other facets we've kind of just chatted about. It's something I get very excited about, and it's called a conservancy, and it's a kind of a new model for conservation, which attempts to address some of the problems of fortress conservation, which we talked about above, but also attempts to achieve a sustainable form of tourism, which provides real benefits to local communities and makes a significant contribution towards wildlife conservation and, the preservation of a wider ecosystem. So the conservancies that I've heard about are both in Kenya, so I've read quite a lot about the conservancies on the Laikipia Plateau. Olariñero is the very famous run by Kuki Gallman. Ol Pejeta, where the two remaining northern white rhinos are, is also a conservancy run along this model. The ones with the most information that I found online, which I'm going to tell you about now as a case study, are the Northern Mara conservancies of Perini, Olaire Orok, and the fantastically named Motorogi. My pronunciation is probably awful there, I assume. So obviously we know Masai Mara, Serengeti, these vast, pristine ecosystems with local people gradually pushed to the outside. This creates a tension where you've got people who used to live in the park now living on subpar land on the outside. This creates a tension because they want to go back in, reclaim their natural land and the subsistence lifestyle they had. So there are three elements to these kind of conservancy concepts. The first is environment. Stop the degradation of the Mara, reversing declines in wildlife, increasing biodiversity, habitat recovery. Good things. Then community. So giving Maasai landowners genuine and meaningful benefits from allowing their lands to be used for conservation, which is good. And these are three pillars, each equal to each other. And then the third one is tourism, creating a new form of tourism with a real economic boost, better viewing experience for visitors, and kind of avoiding the minibus crowding style safari that you do see in the Mara. So it's not a new concept in that it builds on actually some colonial concepts. So in the 1800s, a German explorer and colonial administrator, an all-round awful guy if you read his Wikipedia page, called Major Hermann Wissmann, actually had a good idea for an awful guy, suggesting that, and I'm quoting from, I haven't got it, a book, Among the Elephants by the Douglas Hamiltons, and he said, wherever possible, the resident tribe in each area should, through its chief, be made responsible for elephant hunting and preventing any hunting from outsiders. So this is a kind of precursor idea for what we're talking about now. Obviously, the earlier recommendation was made to preserve numbers of game for white hunters to shoot at, not the kind of ethical standpoint that the new model is taking. The British Colonial Office also made a similar recommendation around the same time. Native chiefs should be given a pecuniary interest in the preservation of game as well as the enforcement of game laws. Again, you should note the interest in game and the lack of any moral or ethical argument. So, I'm going to show you a picture now on the screen. This is a photo of the Northern Mara ecosystem. So in red you can see this is the actual game reserve. Orange is the areas they can't hunt in, and yellow are the areas and the names of the individual sub-tribes which live in them, which were historically pushed out of the red area, and so you can see they now occupy a fringe around it. This is the second map I'm showing you, and what it shows you is how, working with the Maasai landowners, wildlife conservancies, a new area have been formed. So you've still got all the yellow, you've still got the red, but you can see the green, pink, light green and purple in the middle. These are the new conservancies which are forming. And a bit of backstory, we know a new model in this particular ecosystem is necessary. Dr. Joseph Agutu, a Kenyan statistician, conducted a study and looked at densities of wildlife since aerial monitoring began in 1975. Covered 12 species of large animal over a 33-year period, and he found that numbers of impala, warthog, giraffe, topi and Coke's hartebeest have declined in the Mara by over 70%, and beyond the reserve in these yellow ecosystems and the orange ecosystem, buffalo and wild dogs had all disappeared. And he identified that habitat loss on the community-owned yellow lands is actually one of the most important issues, because we know that these yellow lands surrounding reserves, because all of these issues we talked about, connectivity, fortress conservation, the success of conservation in those areas is as important as within the national park. So this is where the conservancy concept comes in. So these conservancies are areas of at least 7,000 acres of community-owned land made up of individual parcels leased from the owners and set aside exclusively for wildlife. On that lease, the payment is per acre, not per tourist, and is made monthly regardless of tourist numbers, and it's paid directly to every individual landowner and not to a central committee, so there's less chance of money going surreptitiously astray. And the key thing here is the continued ownership of the land by the individual Maasai title deed holders. The lease is paid to the Maasai by the safari operators who run the tourism activities within the conservancy. Because the safari operators are operating on Maasai land, this gives employment opportunities for the landowner Maasai families, such as camp staff, guides, rangers. They're all drawn from the local Maasai. So you've got these small, authentic, low-impact, eco-friendly bush camps. That's quite important, low impact, because they're maximum density of 1 camp per 700 acres, only a max size of 12 tents per camp. The Maasai do have to do their part, so they vacate the area. They remove all their homesteads and livestock bomas, so there's no habitation within the conservancy, and grazing of livestock and cattle is controlled. Sometimes it's excluded, but there may be rotational grazing. What's really interesting is they've already seen an increased rainfall in these areas due to rebanding vegetation from the microclimate. The conservancy is managed by a warden and rangers whose costs are covered by the safari company, and this results in little to no poaching within the community because for the Maasai, their land and the wildlife becomes economical for them to protect. There's also a fantastic school called the Koyaki Guiding School, which trains school children for a career running their conservancies. And that's the key point. It's their conservancies that they're running.
I really like that. It's a much more
like
inclusive model than just keeping people out.
Yeah. It's saying, okay, yes, can you move out? But you still own the land and you run all the operations within it. And so this was a review, and so this was taken from the Perini Camp's website, Conservancy website. So, I don't know the person that made this review. I can't speak to its veracity. But the review said this, and it was quite nicely summed up. So I'm going to quote here from the website. The Perini Camp's conservancy concept of engaging the Maasai in gainfully using their land as a conservancy has allowed wildlife to return in large numbers. Moreover, it has allowed the Maasai to step into the 21st century while staying in touch with their roots and still earning a modern wage. From the point of view of the tourist, you get an authentic experience of the African bush and its peoples, while staying in camps that have most of the creature comforts that urban mankind has got used to. The drives are individual and off the beaten track. The guides are English-speaking Maasai who naturally have intimate knowledge of their land. In brief, the Perini people are the flip side of the parasitic tour operator. And I really like how
I like that.
They've kind of phrased that. Again, I don't know who wrote that review. Maybe it was them, but it seems like the conservancy, in particular in East Africa, is a very new model of conservation, a true alternative to fortress conservation. And I think I'm getting quite excited about it. We need to go and visit these Northern Mara conservancies.
Yes, we do. Yeah, I really like that idea. I think the idea, it's like one step ahead of like community-based management, which I am really in favour of. But I like the idea of it. It's not just giving them a seat at the table, it's giving them the table. It's they can then give us a seat at the table if, sorry, again, I'm saying they and us, I keep doing this. It's
safari operations.
They, if it's their land, it's up to them who they include within it. And so that's, instead of it being almost the other way around, and I think that's really powerful.
No, absolutely. It's very, very exciting, I think, that this is something that could take off, not just in Africa, but kind of around the world, of recognising, like you're saying, Kate, the vital knowledge of indigenous local people who have lived there for generations and generations, and it's unrivaled, the knowledge that they have. So good for people, good for wildlife, good for livelihoods. It's what we like to see.
Yeah.
And get ready, because the Biome team are going to go to Kenya. We really should.
We should. I would love to go to one of these conservancies and just talk to the people there.
Yeah. Ola Liniero up in the Laikipia Hills is definitely somewhere to go as well. Those
100%.
conservancies. Oh. So should we do a little quick discussion of what we think? We won't come to a finished opinion, I don't think, as we do in some of the other ones, because we're not really having that kind of discussion. But what do we think? What have we? How have we processed all this information we've been chatting about?
I mean, I definitely think it's made me question what wild means, because I don't know, the idea of fences is, we've outlined some of the pros, some of the cons, but does it truly mean that you've got pristine wild habitats? Can we truly have wild pristine habitats in a modern anthropogenic world. I feel like it's more with the conservancy kind of strategy, it's moving towards living alongside wildlife rather than fencing us out or wildlife in. But it has made me think a lot about what we consider wild spaces to be.
I think, and this is probably going to come out incredibly negative, but I don't actually mean it in such a dark way as I'm going to say. But I don't think there is such a thing as a truly pristine ecosystem or natural space, and I don't think it's possible to have one given the current pressure that humans are putting on the world. And I think that's because you can put up as many fences as you like, you can put in as many regulations as you like, but global forces of climate change are going to come whether we stop them or not, because a lot of the issues that are surrounding kind of conservation at the moment are not physical things that we can stop. Some of them are. Something like poaching is something we can actually physically stop, and obviously we can try our best to tackle them, limit the impacts of climate change and kind of stop it getting to an irreversible level, but they're not something we can like physically see and attach. And it's sort of when we discussed trophy hunting, we said trophy hunting's often a scapegoat because it has a face, and I think this is the issue of why we can't really have these pristine areas anymore, because they're going to be impacted by the kind of global forces of climate change. And so the idea of kind of endlessly trying to achieve that, I think, is a little bit futile, and that's not necessarily what we should be aiming for. So I don't think, as much as I think it's very sad to say that I don't think we can have pristine ecosystems anymore, I don't necessarily think that's as bad as we think it is, because I think we just need to alter what we're aiming for. I think what we want is a world where people and wildlife can coexist, and we don't have this separation anymore, and that we have a world where biodiversity can persist and we can kind of end this biodiversity crisis, but that people can also persist and live alongside, work together. And I do think we need to move away from this separation. I think that's quite clear. But I don't think we should be aiming for kind of pristine ecosystems, because I think that kind of ties into fortress conservation again. And the idea of what a pristine ecosystem is in our heads is that there's no people there, and I don't think having no people there is necessarily the right way to go either.
So given everything we've spoken about fortress conservation, and now that we're thinking about how we should manage these ecosystems, and given what we said about conservancies, this is what I'm really interested in, what you guys think, because I think I might be a little bit wide of the mark of you guys. Is there any place, do you think, for fortress conservation in the world today?
I think there is, but not in the way it was done in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. I think I think from the ecology and the wildlife perspective, I think there is. I think given some threats to biodiversity, and the one I'm thinking of is poaching, I do think fortress conservation is beneficial to certain areas and certain populations and certain species. However, not traditional fortress conservation that excludes people. I think when I say there is a place for fortress conservation, I mean there's a place for having fences in some areas and having designated areas that are confined and that are heavily managed. I do think they need to be run by or with local people, and I think that the traditional 1950s fortress conservation there's no place for. But I think I don't think all fences should just come down. I think that would be silly. I think the establishment of national parks has done a lot for conservation, but I think it's too fragmented at the minute, and it's too isolated, and we're losing everything else. I think we definitely don't want to get to a point where wildlife only exists in national parks or fenced off areas, and I think we're dangerously close to that.
Mm. Yeah, no.
What do you think, Emma?
I kind of am seeing the way forward is kind of with conservancies, but with fenced areas within that. So I don't think it's realistic that we can just get rid of fences in modern society, because ultimately if you just let animals roam, they are going to come into contact with roads and human settlements, and there's going to be human-wildlife conflict there. But if you can have fenced off areas with connective strips between areas of land and have the local people managing that land, that's where I see a place for fences. But I agree with you, Kate. I don't think it has to... It would be very sad if we got to that stage where the only place where wildlife could exist is in these fenced-off areas, and you've also displaced people in the process. But what about you, Robi? What's your opinion on this?
Again, a caveat, as you say, Kate, when I talk about there being a place for fortress conservation, categorically does not include any forced displacement of indigenous peoples. When I'm going to say that there is a place for it in certain areas, I mean the establishment of gazetted national parks and game reserves. The human element, I think, has to be completely condemned and completely never done again. And I think there should be reparations for it in the past. I think there is a place for quite firm fortress conservation of the type that I'm describing in the world, but not Africa. And the way I'm going to explain this is, if you think about it, okay, and this is going back to the Pleistocene, and I know I bring everything back to the Pleistocene, but no, there's a thing here. So, Africa is the only continent where human beings have co-evolved with megafauna. And that's the reason Africa is the only continent with its large megafauna intact. So I think in Africa, fortress conservation it doesn't need to happen at all, because we know for the entirety of human history, we have coexisted with megafauna and large animals in the wilderness in Africa, and there haven't been any extinctions. Africa didn't lose its megafauna, so we know in Africa, with those animals in that ecosystem, with African people, it's totally possible to not have fortress conservation. So I would like to see, I'm not going to get rid of any national parks. I think national parks are amazing, but I would like to see a massive spread of the conservancy system there. And yeah, the key thing why I think it doesn't need to happen in Africa is because we co-evolved there. There haven't been massive extinctions in the past, and because they're still megafauna-dominated ecosystems. However, in the rest of the world, both of the American continents, Europe, Asia, Oceania, we did have megafaunal extinctions. And so I don't think you can ever say that any group of people in those areas has lived to the same degree of harmony as indigenous African people might have done in Africa because of the megafaunal extinctions. So there, in the rest of the world, I do see more of a place for big national park fortress conservation style things. Because I think those ecosystems have... the habitat cycling in those ecosystems has already broken down, because we don't have vast herds of mammoths anymore in Siberia and all these things. Europe used to be a Serengeti, and we don't have water buffalo in Europe and things. And so I think in those areas, because the damage has already been done to a greater degree, big fortress national park things are more relevant. The one caveat with that, I think, would be rainforests, which, regardless of whether they were always rainforests or not, they're much more stable than a savanna mosaic. Like, a rainforest is a rainforest, and it's a rainforest. So somewhere like the Amazon, or even the Congo, I'm fine for that to be just a big national park, boom. And because a national park is designed to protect a stable ecosystem, which isn't as in flux so much as a savanna ecosystem. Interestingly, I think conservancies could really take off in Europe, because a conservancy is naturally more suited to a dynamic landscape, and it's naturally suited to having people in it with agriculture. As rewilding takes off across Europe, I would quite like to see the spread of conservancies there. So that's, I think, my final take on it. Fortress conservation as it used to be is bad. I think there may be some cases, not necessarily in Africa. I think there are cases outside of Africa where it could be used. And I would just like to see conservancies spread. I think they're a great idea.
I agree. I think to kind of end off, because we kind of started by saying this was going to be quite a theory-based episode, and we have obviously provided a lot of examples, but I think it has been quite a theory-based episode. And I think to end, I think sometimes a lot of these discussions that we have in conservation are incredibly interesting, and I really enjoy them. But at the end of the day, a lot of it doesn't matter in terms of, and when I say that, I mean, these definitions and these really big kind of abstract concepts. it's fascinating, and they do matter. Research is important, and understanding these things is important. But when you think about the meaning of wild, and you say, is something in a fenced area truly wild? But yeah, no, like at the end of the day, it's a living creature that has a benefit to this planet, and we have to. I think we have a moral obligation as well as a, practical obligation for the survival of our species and biodiversity to conserve biodiversity. And so, you could say if you're in a confined space and you're, bringing animals in, they're not wild animals. It's just a glorified, captivity because they're still being kept in places. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. That distinction of the kind of semantics around it isn't as important as the practicality of we need to conserve biodiversity. And I think that is something that fortress conservation in the modern context, taking out the kind of atrocities done towards people, but the kind of the idea of fences and penned-in areas have a massive benefit because they do allow for the conservation of biodiversity and the persistence of biodiversity, and they allow people to come in and see biodiversity and become connected to it. So I think whether or not it's wild, whether or not those kind of questions aren't as important as does this allow for biodiversity to persist for longer? That's the more important question that I think we need to be asking. And as much as I love these conversations, I think they're really interesting. At the end of the day, I don't really care whether you would class that as a wild ecosystem or not. What I care about is whether that ecosystem is there
and
not.
Functioning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I completely agree.
that's very true. I feel like it's just, especially this episode is very much a discussion of some very interesting ideas that are kind of floating around in conservation and have strategies in the past and how we might move forwards. But like you say, I fully agree. It's about preserving biodiversity and kind of people's cultural and just livelihoods for the future.
And I think it is important to have these chats because a lot of time chats which go on for like 2 hours because a lot of the time in social media and in the media as a wider thing, you just get blanket statements of one side or the other. You just get we need more national parks, or you just get national parks are bad because they displace people, and you don't ever actually have the opportunity to think for yourself and think, oh, well, why? Let's look at the history. Let's look at the pros, the cons, and as we found out in this episode, the pros and cons sort of don't really matter. The detail, it's weird that this episode, the detail is actually less relevant than the big picture. But yeah, I think it's important we have these talks.
Yeah, I do as well. When I say they don't matter, I don't mean literally they don't matter. I think they're incredibly important. I just think sometimes in conservation, the thing that we need and that we definitely don't have is time. And I think a lot of these conversations, if we had loads of time to fix some of the big problems, it would be great, and we should really agonise over these details. But we don't have time, and time's really not on our side. Just resources in general, time, money, not on our side. And so sometimes you have to just go with what you've got and focus more on just trying to make things better than trying to make things perfect, I guess, is the big distinction, and something that conservation I think has to do a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think anyone should come out of this podcast thinking, right, we're going to get rid of all the national parks, because what would that achieve, and B, that would do so much damage.
Yeah, it would be a complete disaster.
We categorically don't want you to come out of this hating national parks and thinking we want to get rid of them. We want you to think, oh, okay, so going forward, how do we better the process? How do we make it more efficient, more ethical, more moral? Because, we're all on the same side. We all want to see... Well, I want to see rhinos gambling across Europe, and I want to see habitat corridors between Sumatra and
what we all want is a world that provides a sustainable future for the persistence of wildlife and people. And continuously doing something that was done in the 1950s, probably not going to do that. And so, like any industry, you have to adapt and evolve. But that doesn't mean that you just tear down everything that's already been done. Quite literally tear down.
Yeah, but I guess as always, this is a discussion we want with everyone who's listening, watching, so please comment or reach out to us. We're happy to have a conversation about this, and And yeah, I guess a good place to wrap up here. So if you want any more information about things that we're doing, all our content is on our website, which is www.biome-project.co.uk. And if you want to check us out on Instagram, we post conservation-y, wildlife-y things.
Snipe. I got a snipe recently. I was very pleased with my snipe.
Yes. So
First ever
awesome.
snipe.
It was pretty impressive footage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was pleased
very
with my
cool.
snipe.
So Robi is Robi Watkinson Wildlife. I'm Emma Hodson Wildlife, and Kate is conservation_Kate on Instagram. So feel free to check us out, and we will see you in the next episode.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.